You know, it's interesting, with each of these commandments, they were given to show us God's character. They were given to show us what a community that's redeemed by God looks like. And it's worth asking, are you inspired by this vision of godly community? I know I am. I mean, I think about it. If I were a part of a church that was responding to God's grace in our lives by committing to be as holy as we possibly can and by committing to be as much like Jesus as we possibly can, that's really attractive. In fact, that's one of the things that attracts me to Jersey Baptist Church, because I think by and large people are trying to be as holy as they possibly can. And that's an attractive thing. But it's interesting, the Israelites, upon receiving God's commandments for how to live in redeemed community, they were terrified. Look at verses 18 and 19 of Exodus 20, which says this: "When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, 'Speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die.'" They were terrified. They just received the covenant standards. They just received the standards for what a redeemed community would look like. They should be rejoicing. But before a holy God, measured against His holy standard, Israel was exposed. Because they were a sinful people. And actually, I can understand where they're coming from. Because yes, God's law reveals to us God's character. And yes, it shows us what godly community ought to look like. But it also reveals areas of our lives where we don't measure up. It reveals our sin. And the problem is that while God's law can show us God's character, it can show us the way redeemed community ought to behave, and it can show us our sin, it can't actually take our sin away. Which is why Israel was frightened when they received God's law. Here's an illustration that might help us understand. None of our kids are in school right now, but imagine that they were going back to school. Oftentimes when you do back to school, you get the new school supply pack. You know, it's a packet where you get pencils and a sharpener and a little plastic ruler and a little rubber eraser to erase mistakes, and it all comes in one little package. Well, the law, God's law, is like the ruler in that packet. It can be used to show us the standard of measurement that God holds us to. And that standard is God's character. It can show us how we measure up by putting God's standard up against our behavior. And it can show us where we don't measure up. But it's no eraser. It will not erase our sin. In receiving the law, Israel had a school supply pack with a ruler, but their fear was that they didn't have an eraser. And so they turned to Moses. And in verse 20, Moses lets them know that their fear caused by the giving of the law would be used by God to instill in them a holy reverence for God. Look at verse 20. Moses says to the people, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear or the reverence of God would be with you to keep you from sinning." Moses says, don't fear, because the law will point you towards godliness. It will restrain your sin as you realize how holy God is and you begin to fear Him. What Israel needed most was a mediator, someone who would stand between them and God. And Moses is that mediator. In Exodus chapters 20, verses 19 to 21, Moses is the one that stands between the people and God. And so if the Ten Commandments give us a picture of God's character, and they give us a picture of what redeemed community looks like, Moses gives us a picture of what God's Redeemer would look like. But you know, it's interesting. Ultimately, Moses was just a shadow of a mediator, because he couldn't erase our sins. I mean, Moses was just a man. He was just a sinful man. But the very good news is that Jesus Christ is God's mediator. He's the one who stands between us and God, and who can and did erase our sins. We are redeemed through Jesus, who took all of our sin on the cross, and he erased our sin with his blood, and it's through Christ that we're made holy. It's through him that we're able to begin to act like the community who's been redeemed by God. And the Ten Commandments are not only the standard by which God judges his community, it's not only the standard by which God says this is what godly community should look like and this is what my character looks like. They are also in place to show us our need for Christ. Because the Ten Commandments reveal our sin. And they can't erase our sin. Only Jesus can do that.